Today, we're talking about how women manipulate men who don't set boundaries, and why sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back and stop engaging. Before we go any deeper, let me break this down in the simplest way. Whenever you tolerate behavior that hurts you, disrespects you, or leaves you anxious, you unintentionally teach the other person what they're allowed to do. And in my years as a therapist, I've seen this pattern unfold more times than I can count. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever felt like you were giving everything in a relationship and getting confusion, inconsistency, or emotional games in return, this topic is going to hit close to home. I've sat across from countless men who thought patience, kindness, or loyalty would eventually earn them respect. But what actually happened? They became the man she pushed, pulled, tested, and kept on standby, not because she was evil or malicious, but because he never showed her where his limits were. Let me be clear, this isn't about blaming women or painting them as villains. This is about understanding human behavior, especially the behavior that appears when someone knows they can stretch the rules without consequences. When boundaries don't exist, manipulation doesn't always look like manipulation. Sometimes it looks like canceling plans last minute, being affectionate one day and cold the next, or using silence to keep you guessing. And when a man has no sense of where his emotional lines are, those patterns can quietly take root. I've watched men lose themselves here, adjusting their needs, shrinking their voice, and hoping that if they just hold on a little longer, things will change. But relationships don't work like that. Respect comes from clarity, not from constantly proving yourself. So in this video, we're going to break down the subtle ways this dynamic forms, why ignoring her at the right moment can reset the balance, and how boundaries aren't walls, they're self-respect in action. 1. How lack of boundaries creates emotional imbalance. When I talk to men about boundaries, many of them picture something harsh or confrontational. But in reality, a boundary is simply you teaching someone how to treat you. And when those boundaries aren't present, the emotional dynamic in a relationship shifts. Quietly, slowly, but powerfully. I've watched this happen in the therapy room more times than I can reveal, and every time it follows the same pattern. The man starts out wanting to be understanding, patient, and supportive. And somewhere along the way, he becomes the one carrying all the emotional weight while getting very little in return. Here's the thing about relationships, especially romantic ones. People respond to what you allow. When you don't voice your discomfort, when you let things slide, when you say, "It's fine," even though it's not, you create a space where the other person begins to lead the emotional rhythm, not because they're cruel or manipulative by nature, but because most people naturally lean toward what benefits them. Without boundaries, you become the one adjusting, accommodating, and overextending. That's where imbalance begins. In my work, I've seen men who thought they were being generous with their flexibility. They didn't want to seem controlling, so they tolerated last-minute cancellations. They didn't want to start arguments, so they accepted inconsistent communication. They didn't want to jeopardize the connection, so they ignored their own needs. What they didn't realize is that every time you silence your needs, you amplify hers, even unintentionally. And here's where it gets emotionally dangerous. Once a woman realizes you have no line, no point where you say, "This doesn't feel right for me," a subtle shift happens. She becomes the one setting the tempo, deciding when you talk, how much closeness exists, and what kind of treatment becomes normal. You may feel frustrated, confused, or unappreciated, but because you never address it, the imbalance grows. This isn't always intentional manipulation. Often, it's simply the outcome of a dynamic where only one person has a clear sense of their emotional boundaries. Men without boundaries often end up in a reactive role. Instead of leading their emotional life, they respond to hers. If she's warm, they feel secure. If she's distant, they panic. If she's unsure, they cling. Your emotional state starts revolving around her behavior rather than your own internal stability. And that's what emotional imbalance truly is, when your peace depends on someone else's mood. What I've learned over years of listening to men unpack these patterns is that boundaries aren't about controlling her. They're about grounding yourself. They protect your emotional space. They prevent you from losing your voice in the relationship. And most importantly, they keep the connection balanced so you don't end up in a dynamic where you feel powerless. Without boundaries, you leave the door wide open for misunderstandings, mixed signals, and yes, even manipulation. Boundaries aren't walls, they're anchors. And when a man has none, he drifts. 2. Why some women test men who don't stand firm. One thing I've learned in years of sitting with men in therapy is this: people test the strength of what they're leaning on. It's human nature. And when a man doesn't set boundaries, some women, again, not out of cruelty, but out of curiosity, insecurity, or habit, will push to see how far things can go. This is where many men misunderstand the dynamic. They think they're being generous, flexible, or easygoing. But in her eyes, it can sometimes signal something very different: a man who doesn't know his own limits. Let me be clear. These tests aren't always conscious. Most of the time, a woman isn't sitting there thinking, "Let me see how much I can get away with." Instead, she's responding to what she perceives. When a man never pushes back, never speaks up, never says, "This doesn't work for me," she begins to wonder whether he truly has a backbone. Some tests come from insecurity. She may need reassurance that you're confident enough to lead yourself. Others come from past experiences. If she dealt with passive or overly agreeable partners before, she may push boundaries without even realizing it. And sometimes it's simply emotional convenience. If she can dictate the pace and you always adjust, why wouldn't she? I've watched this pattern play out in relationships where the man wanted to avoid conflict, so he let small things slide. But those small things never stay small. When you don't address a behavior the first time, you unintentionally encourage it. She comes late again. She becomes inconsistent again. She withdraws affection again. And every time you accept it without speaking up, the test escalates. Eventually, she begins to question whether you have a sense of self strong enough to create a healthy relationship. And here's something men rarely consider: she's also watching how you protect your emotional world. A woman who feels safe with you, not controlled, not dominated, wants to know that you can hold your own. She wants to see that you can say no when something genuinely doesn't align with your values or needs. When you fail to do that, she doesn't just lose respect, she loses clarity about where the relationship stands. I've had sessions where men were shocked when I told them, "She doesn't want you to agree with everything. She wants to feel you." Not emotionally explosive, not reactive, present, firm, grounded. When a man doesn't hold his position, he becomes emotionally unpredictable because everything he does is based on keeping the peace instead of being honest. That's when tests become more frequent. Men often interpret these tests as manipulation, but many times they are responses to uncertainty. When a woman feels unsure of your strength, she tries to measure it. When she feels unsure of your leadership, she pushes to see where you stand. And when she sees no line, she keeps pushing, not out of malice, but because the relationship lacks structure. Understanding this changes everything. It teaches men that boundaries aren't about shutting a woman down. They're about showing her that the connection has stability. When she sees you hold your ground, the tests stop. The respect returns, and the relationship becomes healthier for both of you. 3. The subtle ways manipulation starts. When manipulation shows up in a relationship, it rarely walks in loudly. It tiptoes. It starts small, so small that most men don't even realize what's happening until they feel emotionally drained or confused. In my experience working with men, the subtle moments are the ones that do the most damage because they blend in with normal relationship behavior. They feel harmless. They feel like things you should let go or not make a big deal about. And that's exactly why they gain power. One of the first signs is inconsistency. Not the dramatic kind, just enough to keep you guessing. One day she's warm, texting you first, planning time together. The next day, she's distant, slow to respond, or suddenly unsure about everything. You find yourself trying to figure out what changed. Most men blame themselves at this point. Maybe I said something wrong, or maybe she needs space. But here's what I tell men in my sessions. Your confusion is the first clue. When someone shifts their behavior without communicating, it places you in a reactive position. You start adjusting to her mood instead of checking in with your own. The next subtle form is emotional bargaining. It doesn't sound manipulative, it often sounds like guilt. She might say things like, "I just feel like you don't care as much," or "I needed you and you weren't there." Even when you've been showing up consistently, these statements tug at your empathy. You want to prove your intentions. You want to make sure she feels valued. And in doing so, you start overextending. You give more. You try harder. Meanwhile, she hasn't actually communicated what she wants clearly. You're left guessing again. Another subtle entry point is shifting responsibility. I've watched men sit on my couch feeling defeated because every disagreement somehow became their fault. Not through arguments, not through shouting, but through emotional redirection. If she's upset, you comfort her. If she's distant, you reach out. If she withdraws, you pursue. Eventually, you're carrying the emotional labor of two people. And then there's selective affection. This one is powerful because it feels good until it doesn't. She becomes affectionate when she wants attention or reassurance, but pulls away when you need clarity or support. It creates an emotional reward system that trains you to respond to her approval instead of your own needs. It's not always intentional, but it's incredibly effective at keeping a man hooked. What I often remind men is that subtle manipulation thrives where boundaries are absent. These patterns don't always come from malicious intent. Sometimes they come from insecurity, fear, or learned behavior. But regardless of the source, the result is the same. You start losing your emotional footing. The key is noticing the shift early. Not to attack her, not to accuse, but to check in with yourself. Because once you recognize these subtle patterns, you're no longer someone who gets pulled by them. You become someone who chooses how to respond, and that's when the dynamic begins to change. 4. How men accidentally reward disrespect. In therapy, I often hear stories that follow the same emotional pattern. A man comes in confused, frustrated, and exhausted, wondering how a relationship that once felt promising has turned into something that constantly drains him. He doesn't want to shame her, doesn't want to be unfair, and often feels guilty even bringing up his concerns. And somewhere in the middle of his story, a moment always stands out. The moment he unintentionally rewarded the very behavior that was hurting him. Let me give you a scenario, not about any specific client, but a combination of patterns I've watched countless men experience. Imagine a man who deeply cares about his partner. He's patient, gentle, and wants to avoid conflict at all costs. So when she cancels plans last minute, he says, "No worries." When she pulls away for a few days without explanation, he reassures her instead of asking why. When she gets upset and shifts blame onto him, he apologizes even when he's not sure what he did wrong. In his mind, he's maintaining peace. In her experience, he's signaling that anything goes. This is the part men don't realize. When you treat disrespect like it's acceptable, it becomes a pattern. Not because she's intentionally mistreating you, but because human behavior adapts to the path of least resistance. If she learns that you'll still be available, still be affectionate, still be consistent, even when she isn't giving you the same energy, why would the dynamic ever change? I've seen men convince themselves that being overly forgiving is the noble route. They think, if I'm patient enough, she'll see my value. But relationships don't work that way. When you don't address behavior that hurts you, the other person often assumes it didn't bother you, or worse, that it's normal for you. Over time, these small moments build up. She starts expecting you to absorb her moods. She expects you to be there even when she's the one pulling away. She expects you to adjust, explain yourself, chase, and fix things, even those that weren't your fault. Meanwhile, the man becomes emotionally depleted, wondering how he ended up doing all the work while getting so little stability in return. There's an emotional truth here that many men overlook. Your silence is a response, and your patience can become permission. You don't have to raise your voice to set a boundary. You don't have to be rude or cold. But when you don't speak up, when you don't step back, when you keep prioritizing the relationship over your own well-being, you unintentionally reinforce the very imbalance you're trying to avoid. The man from the scenario eventually reaches a breaking point, not because she changed, but because he didn't. He taught her, unintentionally, that her disrespect would always be met with understanding. And once he realized that, everything shifted. Recognizing this doesn't make you weak, it makes you aware. And awareness is what finally allows a man to stop rewarding disrespect and start rewriting the dynamic. 5. Why pulling back stops the manipulation cycle. There's a moment I've witnessed in many men's relationships. A moment where the dynamic shifts not because they fought, argued, or tried harder, but because they quietly pulled back. I'm not referring to ghosting, punishing someone, or playing mind games. I'm talking about a man finally choosing to protect his emotional space after feeling stretched thin for far too long. Let me paint a familiar scenario, not about a specific client, but a blend of many stories I've seen unfold. Imagine a man who has spent months adjusting himself to keep the relationship afloat. He texts first most days, he initiates affection, he asks the questions, carries the conversations, and repairs things after arguments. Meanwhile, his partner becomes increasingly unpredictable, warm one day, cold the next. Some days she's reassuring, other days she's distant, vague, or dismissive. And because he cares, he keeps leaning in, hoping consistency will bring her closer. But here's the part men rarely see happening. The more he leans in, the less she feels the need to. Not necessarily because she doesn't care, but because he's doing enough emotional labor for two people. She feels no urgency to show up with clarity because he always fills the gaps. Eventually, this man reaches a point of emotional fatigue. Maybe he sits alone after another confusing interaction. Maybe he feels the shift in his own body. Tight shoulders, a pressure in his chest, a constant worry about where they stand. And in that moment, something inside him says, I need space too. He doesn't announce it. He doesn't threaten to leave. He simply slows down. He stops initiating every conversation. He responds when he has the emotional energy to respond. He gives himself room to breathe. This is where the dynamic changes. When he pulls back, she notices the shift, not because he's punishing her, but because the relationship suddenly requires her effort too. She can no longer rely on his constant emotional availability. She has to step forward if she wants to maintain connection, and in many cases she does, because now she can feel the imbalance she previously overlooked. Pulling back in a healthy way removes the reward from inconsistent behavior. It breaks the cycle where she pushes and he always pulls harder. When he steps back, the push-pull pattern collapses. She must either show up genuinely or confront her own emotional inconsistencies. I've seen men worry that giving space will make her disappear, but in most cases, what actually disappears is the manipulation cycle. Why? Because he's no longer feeding it with immediate responses, emotional reassurance on demand, or endless patience for unclear communication. By pulling back, he signals calmly, quietly, that the relationship requires mutual effort. And something remarkable happens. He becomes grounded again. He reconnects with himself. He gains clarity about what he wants and what he will no longer tolerate. Pulling back isn't about power. It's about balance. It's about reminding both people that a relationship is a shared emotional experience, not one person carrying the weight for the other. 6. Building boundaries. Without conflict or fear, most men hear the word boundaries and instantly imagine tension, raised voices, arguments, someone storming out of the room, but boundaries don't have to feel like that. In fact, the strongest boundaries are the ones that never need to be shouted. They're calm, steady, and communicated through action more than explanation. And when I've watched men finally learn how to create boundaries without fear, something powerful happens. They stop feeling like they're walking on eggshells in their own relationships. Here's the truth I've seen again and again in the therapy room. Women respond far better to clarity than they do to emotional uncertainty. A man who knows where he stands doesn't have to dominate, intimidate, or force anything. His presence alone communicates what's acceptable and what isn't. And it's not because he's controlling, it's because he's anchored. The first step is simple, but most men skip it. You must know your own limits before you can express them. I've had men sit across from me listing all the things they tolerate that make them unhappy. Mixed signals, disrespectful comments, last-minute cancellations, emotional withdrawal, and when I ask, "Did you tell her this affects you?" they pause. Not because they don't want to, but because conflict scares them. They're afraid of losing connection. They've spent their whole lives being the reasonable one, the one who calms storms instead of causing waves. But boundaries aren't waves, they're lines in the sand. And if you don't draw them, the relationship gets swept wherever the stronger current goes. The next step is communication. And here's where many men overcomplicate things. They think boundaries require a long speech or emotional breakdown. They don't. A boundary can be as simple as, "I'm not okay with being spoken to like that," or "If plans need to change, I need to know ahead of time." It's direct, honest, and non-threatening. You're not blaming. You're not attacking, you're simply telling the truth. But the real strength of boundaries comes from follow-through. Words without action mean nothing. If she crosses a line and you do nothing, you've taught her that the line doesn't matter. But when you stay calm, step back, or pause the conversation until respect is restored, you reinforce the boundary without ever raising your voice. And here's what surprises most men. Women appreciate this. Not the withdrawal, not the anger, the steadiness, the groundedness, the reliability. A relationship feels safer when both people know the emotional rules. When you enforce boundaries gently, you're not creating distance, you're creating trust. The final piece is self-respect. Boundaries aren't just for the relationship, they're for you. They protect your time, your energy, and your emotional well-being. They help you stay connected without losing yourself. I've seen boundaries transform men, turning anxiety into calm, confusion into confidence, and emotional chaos into clarity. And none of it required conflict, just honesty, consistency, and the courage to stand firmly in who you are. 7. Reclaiming self-respect through healthy distance. There's a moment in nearly every man's healing process when he realizes something powerful. The distance he was afraid to create is the very thing that brings him back to himself. And when I say distance, I'm not talking about emotional punishment, silent treatment, or disappearing acts. I'm talking about a man finally stepping back enough to see his own worth clearly, without the noise, without the pressure, and without constantly trying to fix someone else's emotional world. Healthy distance is one of the most misunderstood tools in a relationship. Men often think, if I pull back, she'll think I don't care. But what I've witnessed over and over again in therapy is the opposite. When a man sets healthy distance, he communicates something profound. I care about this connection, but I care about my sanity, peace, and dignity too. Imagine a man who has spent months or even years overextending himself in a relationship. He's always accommodating, always understanding, always available, even when she's inconsistent or emotionally unpredictable. He's lost parts of himself trying to hold the relationship together. He hasn't laughed the way he used to. He hasn't pursued his goals the way he once did. His hobbies, his friendships, even his rest. All of it has taken a back seat to keep the relationship afloat. One day he wakes up and realizes he no longer recognizes himself. Healthy distance becomes the turning point. When he steps back, something shifts internally. He starts giving energy to the things that used to inspire him. He reconnects with people who remind him of his value. He fills his days with activities that make him feel grounded and alive. And slowly, he remembers who he is outside of that relationship dynamic. This is where self-respect grows roots, not in arguments, not in ultimatums, but in rediscovering the parts of yourself that got lost along the way. Here's what makes this distance truly transformative. It forces clarity, not just for him, but for her as well. When he is no longer filling every gap, soothing every mood shift, or carrying every emotional burden, she has to face her contribution to the dynamic. Some women step up, they communicate better, they show more consistency, they take responsibility. Others may pull away, and while that can hurt, it also reveals a painful but important truth. A relationship that collapses because you stopped over-functioning was never balanced to begin with. Healthy distance gives a man perspective. It reveals what's genuine and what's dependent on him sacrificing parts of himself. It shows him whether she values the relationship itself or the convenience of his emotional availability. But the most important part is internal. Self-respect isn't something you say, it's something you grow into through action. When a man gives himself space, he stops negotiating his worth. He stops begging for clarity. He stops shrinking to avoid conflict. The distance becomes a mirror, showing him the strength he forgot he had. Reclaiming self-respect isn't loud. It's steady. It's quiet. It's a man choosing himself not to abandon her, but to stop abandoning himself. When a man learns to set boundaries, protect his peace, and create healthy distance, everything about the relationship changes. Not because he becomes colder or harder, but because he finally becomes grounded in who he is. The patterns that once left him confused or overwhelmed begin to lose their grip, and he steps into a version of himself that feels stronger, clearer, and more connected to his own worth. This entire journey isn't about controlling anyone. It's about reclaiming self-respect. And once a man starts showing up with that kind of clarity, the dynamic shifts in a way that benefits both people involved.